Good afternoon. Let's get started. So if people could find seats, that'd be great. All right. Fabulous. I'm waiting for the last few people to grab their coffee and find seats, and then we'll get started. Hi, I'm Margot Seltzer. I'm one of the co-heads of computer science, and I am delighted to see you all here. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the original ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I always like to take a moment and remember that we are uninvited guests here. And I'd like to think that moving ahead, we can be better guests than we've been in the past, because I think sometimes in the past, we have been purely abominable guests. So let us all strive to do better in the future. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Radhika Nagpal, the Augustine Professor of Engineering in the departments of Computer Science and Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at Princeton University. Now, many of you know that I can barely remember what happened yesterday. Nonetheless, I can still remember hearing Radhika's job talk when she interviewed at Harvard, which was N years ago for fairly moderately large size values of N. And I literally walked out of that talk thinking, oh my gosh, I've seen the future. That was just based on her PhD and postdoc work. And since then, she has continued to do truly remarkable and just incredibly interesting ideas at the intersection of biologically inspired computing and collective behavior. And her work continues to fascinate me every time I hear about the newest cool thing that she's doing. And I am, of course, not alone. Turns out that Radhika is a jolly good fellow, i.e. of both the ACM and the AAAI. She was an inaugural winner of the Microsoft New Faculty Fellowship, the very first year they offered it, setting a pretty high bar. She is also a winner of the Anita Borg Early Career Award, and she's regularly recognized for the creative and groundbreaking work she does, things like Nature's Top 10 Influential Scientists and Engineers. She was an invited TED speaker. But all that is really only one side of Radhika, because she is also a leader in giving voice to those who don't have it. From blogging about what it's really like to be a pre-tenure faculty member, those of you who talked to her today, hopefully you got some insight from that, to starting the Black in Robotics Boston chapter and the Amazon Day One Fellowship. And it's not just Radhika, she and her entire family are civic-minded and engaged in social justice. And most importantly, she brings these values into her lab and her environment every day. So as I have told many of you, everything I have learned about creating a positive lab culture, I learned from Radhika. And on that note, it's all you.
All right, sorry, while I get dressed here. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I was actually planning to be here in 2020, and then the pandemic happened, and then I thought it would be over in 6 months, and then I would be here again, but here we are so many years later, so I'm really glad to be here, and thank you for all coming to my talk. I'm really excited. I will say that I've learned a lot from Margot, and I have a little bit of a piece for her as well. So you can wait for that. Okay, so I titled my talk Taming the Swarm because I'm really excited about swarms in nature. And so the topic that my lab works on is, we call it collective intelligence or self-organization. And I'm really interested in how very large groups of individuals can interact through maybe simple and local and pairwise interactions, but create higher level complexity through these local interactions. So I think that for a lot of you, there are a lot of examples you can think of: birds, fish, there's just so many examples, just even us as a group. So, so as a computer scientist and a roboticist, how do you study collective intelligence? Well, sometimes I'm lucky enough that studying it looks like this. So this is me on my 45th birthday in Panama. We got to travel as a group to study what I think of as one of the craziest examples of collective intelligence, which is army ants. So millions of army ants work together to create bridges and forage. And this is an example of the nest, which they create out of their own bodies because they're nomadic. And they, whenever they don't like a terrain, they can create bridges out of their own bodies. It's really like science fiction. And it's such an amazing system to study. And we still don't quite know what the rules of these systems are, but we're beginning to understand them. Another system that I like to think of as having collective intelligence is made of smaller elements. So you can think of cells as having a kind of collective intelligence. So cells with identical DNA are self-assembling to create complex structures like ourselves, like starfish, and even capable of repairing their own structures, which I think is just such an amazing kind of programming. It also operates collective intelligence at larger scales. So that was an example of a termite mound. So centimeter scale, insects are creating structures that are 2 to 10 meters high, skyscrapers. And even these skyscrapers can repair from damage and constantly be adjusted. And of course, then there's like fish schools and bird flocks that create so much dynamic structure that maybe I love to snorkel. Maybe some of you are snorkels or scuba dive and are as amazed by bird flocks and fish schools as I am. And I think when I've sort of alluded to some examples, but I'm guessing that everyone here has had some experience of watching these systems and finding them really fascinating. And I think one of the reasons we find them so fascinating is that each individual that's part of this phenomena is just so small and so puny. And yet they're collaborating to create this phenomena that seems so large and so massive. And it seems sort of surprising, like what algorithm would you run in one corner of the swarm such that the whole group could have this level of coordination? And the coordination is so coherent and so beautiful that often we don't even think they're individuals. We're just like a school of fish or a flock of birds. We just think of it as one entity. We're not even thinking that the individuals exist. It's like a single agent. And that's just an amazing level of coherence. So of course, I think that kind of fascination everybody feels when they see these systems. But another sort of really remarkable thing is the algorithms by which people think that this collective behavior arises. So it's believed for most of these systems that there are actually no leaders in charge of the group behavior. So unlike this case where I get to stand in the front, or there's a professor in charge of the group or a dean in charge of a school, here apparently there are no leaders in the system. Instead, the entire complexity of the behavior is arising through the fact that lots of individuals are running the same rules, and somehow those simple rules, when multiplied by this very decentralized and very large system, are actually resulting in this self-organized behavior. And I think that self-organization itself, understanding the algorithms behind that self-organization, seems like a question that many people think of. Wow, the lights are on their own self-organized behavior. All right, so for these systems, as a biologist, the clearer question to ask is like, how do these operate? What are the rules that result in this collective intelligence? But of course, as an engineer, our first thing is like, forget that. How do we build our own? If I can understand even a little bit of the intelligence that exists in nature, AI is there. It's like, how do I create the artificial system of my own? So I think of this as a kind of AI, looking at collectives and creating artificial collectives. So there are lots of cases why you might want to do this. So if you think of really any application of robotics, whether it's agriculture or space or monitoring environments, you're almost never going to deploy a single robot. You're always going to deploy many, many robots together. And if we, eventually have self-driving cars, well, then that's like 1 million of robots on the road. So of course, we would want to program these systems in a way that encourages coherence or that has behavioral properties that we want. and that avoids things like deadlock or bad behavior. So in this sense, understanding rules from nature could give us insights in how to program these systems that we're trying to create. So there's, I think, a very application side to thinking about artificial collective behavior or artificial collective intelligence. For me personally, I think I'm also just interested in the science side of it. So how does complexity arise in all of these cases? What are the kinds of rules? Is there, for example, is there a handbook of algorithms like that have evolved over nature that if you look at cells and ants and fish and birds, are they all kind of doing the same algorithm? Are there common principles? Can we make compilers that can think of a complex behavior a colony has to do and then compose it from these little algorithms from the handbook? And maybe even other things like, is there something like and, or, and not gates from which all complex behavior arises? Are there some basis behaviors from which all other behaviors can be constructed? So I think there are a lot of sort of exciting fundamental questions about the kind of computation that is happening in these collectives. And that maybe that more science side is what drew me to this area in the first place. And so this is what my lab works on. We often look at systems in nature and use that to imagine futuristic robot systems that we could build that can do similar things. So I'll talk about some systems inspired by cells and inspired by termites and army ants, and also inspired by fish. And we're both interested in the collective intelligence. So what are the algorithms? But more recently, my lab has really been getting interested in also the mechanical intelligence. So of course, there's the computation side, but also how does the body and the sensing and the physical nature of communication, how does that embodiment also produce some of the intelligence that we see in nature? So looking both at the morphology and copying ideas from that, as well as copying ideas from the rules and the algorithms themselves. And so we do sort of both of those pieces. And in recent years, we've also really had this great experience of being able to take some of our ideas and apply them to problems that biologists face, and now close that loop where we're both inspired by biology, but also get to contribute to answering questions about natural systems themselves. So it's really this sort of mix and interdisciplinary piece that I think is a lot of what my lab does. So today I'm going to show a bunch of robotic systems, but before that, I wanted to talk a little bit about my journey, because I'm going to show a lot of videos of robots. And today my lab has thousands of robots that we've built, and we've been lucky enough to be able to commercialize 2 of them. I've had some great experiences like going to Panama. Also, I got to give a TED Talk here in Vancouver. I've been on a zero-G flight. We've done exhibits. So all these experiences are true today. But in 2004, when I started as a faculty member at Harvard, I actually had 0 robots. And I had built 0 robots in my PhD as well. So it was a big fat 0. I had a lot of dreams of things that could be, and I had a lot of algorithms. And unfortunately, to make matters worse, in my 2-year reappointment review, a secret and all-male senior faculty committee wrote into my official letter that I should not build robots because it was hard and they didn't think that I had what it took. So there I was with, no robots, no experience, and this idea that I would build robots. And I think my journey from the point where you have dreams to the point where you have stuff wouldn't have been possible without a very large collective. Sorry, it makes me very emotional to say this. Collective of senior women who did a lot of stuff, of which one senior woman was with me the whole way through, which is Margot. Yeah. So thank you for giving me that space so that I could suck it up a little bit and then say what I wanted to say. But Margot was with me the whole way through, starting from that point of 0 robots, including, knowing about the Dyer letter. And she was my idol before I joined there and became a champion and a mentor, and definitely is now my bestie. And she did some crazy things. So in spite of that Dyer letter, Margot just gave me her lab space, and actually it's in her lab space where all of my most famous robots were built. And she supported me in every possible way. She read grants and papers. She even babysat my kids when I had to teach on a day where Harvard did not have a holiday and the daycare did. But she did this supremely hard work every day of fighting bad systems and changing culture. And so I wanted to use this moment to thank her. And yeah, being part of her team has always been an honor. So I had meant to show this picture. I was thinking what it should be, but I've had a great time being part of her team, and I'm just so glad that she's here. And I thought that this would be a good time to collectively thank her, but you guys already applauded. So maybe we'll just do it again. Thank you, Margot. All right. So now I'm going to show you all these robots. Many, at least the first whole set was really built in her lab out of a lot of somewhat secretly. Well, yeah, none of those people remember writing that letter. So it's all good now. All right. So as I said, these different biological systems have really inspired me to build robots. And as Margot said, you know, in my job talk when I first joined at Harvard, I was really thinking about compilers and the question of whether or not it was possible to create compilers for shape. So if you think about cells that organize into shapes, would it be possible to say, well, give me a starfish or give me a fruit fly and shove it through a compiler, and out would come the code that the DNA or the DNA of the cell that would produce the organism. And of course, biologists also think about this as compilers. They think about modularity. They think about similarity between body shapes. And so a lot of my early inspiration came from biology. So as I mentioned, a starfish is, you know, an example of something that cells can create. The picture on the right is a picture of an early stage of a fruit fly where you can actually see this pattern of stripes formed, which is the beginning of a segmented body of an insect. And so when I was a graduate student, I read this amazing article by Professor Nusland Volhard, who won the Nobel Prize in 1995 for discovering how the early pattern formation of the fruit fly formed. And this was really the first time they understood how thousands of cells could organize complex structure. And so what she found was in the fruit fly, they were actually cells at both of the ends of the fruit fly that she called pole cells that created these chemical gradients across the fruit fly. And all of the other cells that are in the fruit fly can then use the strength of those different chemical gradients to decide which part of the structure they are. I'm simplifying it quite a bit, but you could think of it as setting up a coordinate system. So you had some starting point and you set up a coordinate system, and then everyone else can interpret the coordinate system. And she called those chemical gradients morphogen gradients because they create morphogenesis. So imagine, many of people in the field who were thinking about self-assembly were really inspired by morphogen gradients. And wait, let me start. Sorry. Start again. Were inspired by morphogen gradients, and it created this field called programmable matter, or well, it's called programmable matter now. But the question was, could we create robotic cells that could do the same thing? So what if I could create thousands of robotic cells that could self-assemble patterns and shapes? And then I would program them with identical rules, and then they would self-assemble whatever you want, a starfish, a fruit fly, a wrench, whatever it is. And so this was the futuristic goal that motivated the field of programmable matter. And a lot of us were working on how we would build these robotic cells and how we would program them. And so morphogen gradients and this idea of compilers was something that really motivated many of us in the field to create programming languages around self-assembly. But it was a full decade, 2 decades before we could really create enough robotic cells in order to sort of try these ideas out. So this was the genesis of the Kilobot project in my lab, which was to create thousands of robots. So instead of kilobytes, you would have kilobots. And here you can just see a video. So this is all 1,024 of the kilobots. And they're really small, sort of minimalist robots that can move, straight, turn, but they can also communicate with a small number of robots around them. And they communicate wirelessly with a small neighborhood. And so if you want to influence things far away, I can influence the next agents that can then influence the next agents and so on. So anything that you want to do in the whole swarm has to propagate as messages through the system. So it's this really big distributed robotic system. So this was our first attempt to try and create structure or programmable matter. All right. So, okay. So there is some issue. Anyways, so the first thing that we tried to do was to create morphogens, or essentially artificial gradients. So in the diagram, you can see on the left, you pick some sort of seed cell, and that robot has a number, and then it sends a message to its neighbors, which then decrement the number by 1, and then it decrement and decrement. So actually what we're doing really is just a breadth-first search tree, and there are lots of great distributed algorithms for that. But it does mean that you can sort of measure your distance from a pole. So now if I can create many gradients, I can actually create coordinate systems within which now I can interpret patterns. So if you have an artificial morphogen, then maybe you can do artificial morphogenesis. So our next step was, okay, how do we go from gradients to more complex structures? So I'm going to tell you about 3 ways that you can do this. And I want you to think about, like, you could think about manufacturing as part of this as well. So one way is I can start with a seed, and then I can grow a structure. So I can just grow a structure layer by layer by layer. So if you think of this as additive manufacturing, I can basically create something through addition. So we call this idea directed growth. And this is one of the first things that we tried. But another way you can do it is through subtractive. So I can have a set of cells, I can create a coordinate system, create a pattern, and then I can just get rid of the excessive materials, so like etching. So interestingly, both of these options exist in biology. So plants, for example, you can think of as additive growth, but there are lots of examples like your hand, where you start out with webbing actually as the digits are forming, and then the webbing cells have cell death. So a lot of things are formed through cell death. So we actually see both kinds of morphogenesis in nature. And then the third example I'm going to show you is actually from my colleague Sabine Hort's lab, where she looked at a bottom-up method using Turing patterns to create structures. So Turing patterns can create spots and stripes, but then you can use these spots and stripes to then create growth around the spots and stripes. And there's some new studies in biology that suggest that actually your finger digits are formed that way. And that's why it's actually pretty easy, for example, to have an extra digit or less digit, because in fact, you're constraining the number of spots that are forming. And so if you change the boundary conditions, you can change the number of digits that you have. And so she was looking at bottom-up patterns. So we can actually implement all of these on Kilobot. So I'll show you some videos of that. So here's the first example. So these are, you can kind of see Mike in the background. This experiment took about 12 hours. So it's very, very, very sped up because obviously it's going to run now. But as you can see, there's no actual global eye or control. All of the robots know that they're forming a starfish shape, but they can only talk to individual neighbors, and they're essentially taking on and growing this structure over time. So even though we have 1,000 robots, we can create these large-scale, fairly predictable structures. And as you can see, the inside is actually not quite as predictable as the outside. So each time you run the structure, there might be some variation in the system, which I think is very organic, but you can actually create predictable structures. And we show that you could create a large class of structures this way. All right, the second example is, again, the subtractive example. So here we start with a group of cells. There's actually the seed robots are in the middle. You form a coordinate system. It's a little hard to see, but it's basically internally determining a shape. And then through a consensus process, it decides when to get rid of the excessive material. So here we're using light as a way of removing material from the system. And one of the things we were really interested in was, is one way of making a shape better than another? So for example, this method is wasteful in that you have to give up all of these cells that didn't take part, but actually it only took 30 minutes to make this shape. And it actually is considerably more predictable because it requires a lot of imprecise motion rather than precise motion. So I think we're still learning a lot about different kinds of morphogenesis. And I'll show you a video from my colleague One of the things we were able to do with the Kilobots is we were able to commercialize it and also make it open source. So my colleague Sabine Wirth, her lab, actually, their students made more than 1,000 robots. So we were no longer the biggest Kilobot lab anymore. And their lab did this amazing work where they used Turing patterns to create these structures. And they worked with, I think I have it there, James Sharp, who's a biologist who was studying how Turing patterns influence structure. So the interesting thing with Turing patterns is every time you run it, you actually get different structures, because each time the initial conditions can result in different shapes. So it's not as predictable, but you actually get self-repair. So that was something that we weren't able to program in our system. Here, actually, even if you damage the structure, there's some chance that it can recover. And it creates limb-like structures, but you get a lot of different limbs each time. So yeah, so the Kilobots have been a really exciting platform with which we've been able to experiment with this idea of creating artificial morphogenesis. But of course, we're still pretty far from the idea of being able to create programmable matter. So there are a lot of different groups that are thinking more about how you shrink the size of the elements, how you make the elements connect to each other. And there are a lot of sort of exciting ideas in this space that are happening, but it still might be a long time before you have your own swarm to make you the wrench that you needed the other day. The other funny thing I learned was that actually there are also people who are thinking about making the elements larger. So my colleague, Dr. Ariel Ekbla, who's now the director of the Aurelia Institute, which is a nonprofit, has been looking at whether or not in space we can self-assemble structures. So it's so complicated to create structures in space. What if you could take these ideas of morphogenesis and actually use it to create space structures? And so her lab, as part of her thesis and her work, they've built this system called the tesserae, which has these tiles that can self-assemble in space. So I think it's really exciting that there's many more possible applications of self-assembly in cases where it's really hard to make things. But I thought that was even more crazy an idea than I had imagined would be. All right, and I'll actually show some more stuff that we did with Ariel later. All right, so Kilobots are sort of in 2D, and it's still a bit of a step to get to 3D. So social insects are really amazing at working in 3D. So if you think about the termite mounds I mentioned before and the army ants, they're actually using a combination of collective intelligence, but also embodied intelligence. So for example, termites climb over mud and then carry mud. And so suddenly they basically build larger and larger structures that they can make larger and larger. And army ants can do this with each other's bodies. And so for us, these have inspired a lot of different projects. The Termes project was inspired to make robots that collectively could construct, was inspired by termites. But today I'm going to tell you about a project that's been inspired by army ants. So I showed a little bit of this before, and you'll see Melinda in this image too, who led a lot of this work. So army ants actually are really good at creating temporary structures. So rather than building the same structure every time, they're creating structures to solve problems in the environment. So mostly they create bridges. So any terrain that they don't like, they can create a bridge. If you actually make the situation harder, they can adjust the bridge. And so they're constantly adapting to the environment and solving problems in the environment. And for me, what I really find interesting is that, if you look really close up, I'm sorry if this freaks you out, but it sort of is like an organic tissue. It's no longer ants. It's almost like you could have been imagining that these were cells, the way that they're creating and dissolving structure. But it's happening at a much larger scale than cells. So there are a lot of groups that have been studying army ant bridges. And one of the interesting things that biologists know about army ant bridges is that they're very adaptive. So if the traffic is very high along a path, they're much more likely to create a bridge. And the more traffic it is, the more wide the bridge will be. But if you stop the traffic or the traffic dies down, then the bridge will disassemble and go away. So imagine that we had bridges like that in the environment, peak rush hour, they expand to reduce it. And then when there's nothing, they just disappear from view and you get to see the the river without any obstruction. So it's really a crazy system where these bridges can both adapt to traffic, repair, but also dissolve and form whenever necessary. So this is a pretty, from my perspective, a really complicated behavior, but we think that it may arise from a locally very simple hypothesis. So imagine that you are an ant and you're walking along, and then suddenly there's all this congestion. So people are climbing all over you. And of course, like that might hurt to imagine, but just imagine that you're an ant and it doesn't hurt. But there's a lot of congestion, a lot of people are climbing over you. So if that's happening, you decide to turn into a bridge state, which is that you stop walking and you just become part of the infrastructure and you allow people to walk over you. And then maybe you've been in the bridge state for a while and it's been a while since anyone walked on you. And so if there's nobody walking on you and you can get away, you just start walking again. So you're just between these two states, either you're walking or you're a bridge. And what's interesting is that you can actually see how a lot of this behavior can come from this very simple system with a little bit of sort of magic assumption. So if there's a lot of traffic, then there's a lot of congestion. If there's a lot of congestion, then a lot of ants are going to become a bridge. But the bridge actually relieves the congestion because now there's more space to walk on. And so now suddenly there's not as much congestion. So the bridge size is self-limiting. So once the bridge is big enough and the congestion dies out, the bridge won't get any bigger. And then if the traffic dies down, then there are parts of the bridge where there's no traffic, and then those parts of the bridge will basically dissolve and leave. So now you get all of this adaptive behavior from what seems like a really simple local behavior. So this is really, really interesting and something that we were very inspired by. And then secondly, I think another part that was interesting for me or for the roboticists on the team was that when we think of bridges, we think of lattices and trusses and very predictable structures. But if you look at the army ant bridges, they're very messy and they're very imprecise. And there's something really interesting about imprecise, messy structures. One is that you can make them really fast because you don't have to care about how they were put together. They're wasteful in material. They may not be as strong, but they're really fast to put together. And then the other thing is they're actually kind of compliant. So rather than making this very rigid truss, you've made kind of a tissue that can deal with a little bit of unstructured environment or different weird shapes in the environment, or maybe you can even stretch and compress a little bit. And so they're really creating a very different kind of structure than normally roboticists would create. So we were really inspired by this system to think about creating self-assembling robots. So again, this is sort of imagine a future where you had a whole swarm of robots that you could send into an environment. And if they get stuck, they could just create a bridge to get over whatever was difficult for them to get over. Or maybe they could create a chain to get down off of a cliff or span a river. Or maybe they could create a shelter in case it was wet or so on. So they could self-assemble to solve problems in their environment. And the question was, what would it be like to design robots that can do this? And so this is the work that we did with Melinda Malley, who was a PhD student in my group. And I'll show you first the robots that we built, and then I'll show you a little bit about our experiments with the rules. So this is Melinda, and this is the robot in its very green habitat. So it looks nothing like an ant. It's actually just a soft bipedal robot that moves by flipping. So the idea is that you let go of one foot and you swing your foot until you hit something, and then you grab it, and then you just do that over and over again. And so building climbing robots is really hard. So we were interested in thinking about how can you build the simplest climbing robot that can climb in any orientation without a lot of sensing or without a lot of complexity. And if you look at this robot, what's really happening is that it's sort of moving its foot until it finds something to attach to. And this allows it actually to move in any orientation. And because it has a soft body, the compliance of the body, again, allows you to deal with the fact that all of these different surfaces are not aligned as you expected. So we're really looking at how soft robotics could allow us to build robots that could do activities that maybe were hard to do with rigid robots, like climb in an untethered way. And so the soft body actually just has two cables, and that's how it's moving. And the grippers have little corkscrews. So Melinda was really inspired by microspines and tarsal hooks, which is how ants can grab into a lot of textured surfaces. And so she created these corkscrews that could grab into Velcro structures. All right. So here you can kind of see how the body is compressing in order to let the robot move through different sections. So if you now cover the robots in stretchable Velcro, then actually the robots can climb over other robots as well. I don't really care whether I'm climbing over my mates or I'm climbing over unstructured environments. We're getting closer to, for example, how ants are just sort of unconcerned what they're actually climbing over. So here you can see the corkscrew grippers. And here now you can see robots climbing over each other. So there's been a lot of work in self-assembling robots. Mostly they're rigid lattices that have to dock exactly to each other. So we were trying to get away from cellular automata and lattice-like thinking towards these more amorphous and compliant systems. And it's still not as reliable as you would hope, and they're still pretty difficult to manufacture, but this was our first attempt at being able to create robots that might be able to make structures the way army ants do. All right, so we also looked at having them implement the actual algorithm. And so the robots have to sense that they're being walked over. So we decided to use vibration to do that. So here's now you can see two robots running the full algorithm. So the top robot is sort of climbing down the structure. You'll see the bottom robot as well. All right. Now, yeah. And now the top robot climbs over the bottom one, which then detects that it's being climbed over. So it basically decides to stay in the bridge state. So it lets the other individual climb over it. That works well. And then the robot that was in the bridge state decides to go out of the bridge state, but then it escaped. So these were actually really, I would say, like, we only were able to make two robots, but we learned a lot of things. These robots feel very alive. They're able to fall and continue to move. And I think this is one of the areas that a lot of roboticists are really excited about, which is soft robotics, because we can now create systems that are able to deal with a lot more uncertainty without actually the algorithms dealing with a lot more uncertainty. It's really about the morphology being able to deal with a lot of uncertainty. Okay, so we also did simulations to think about how these rules would work in practice. And unfortunately, we still cannot really analyze these rules, even though it seems like there should be statistical ways to understand them. But here, what you're seeing is we have sort of a very abstracted model of the flipping robot. And as the traffic gets higher and there's more congestion, actually, we see exactly the behavior that was predicted, which is you see bigger bridges form, and the bridges tend to stabilize congestion. So once the bridge is sort of smoothing out the path enough, there's no more congestion, which means there's no more bridges. And if you sort of cut off the traffic, so here at the end, you also see some trapped robots because this is 2D and not 3D. But here you can start to see that the bridge will automatically start to disassemble. So there's no point at which any external decision is being made. Individual sort of robots are making individual decisions, but it's all based on this very simple concept of being walked on or not being walked on. And yet the group behavior is really fun to watch. So the V-bridge was really inspired by experiments that biologists had done with army ants, but army ants actually make all kinds of structures. So one of the things we realized is that the same kind of algorithm can also make ramps. So in this case, you just have some arbitrary structure and you get a ramp that forms and a ramp that dissolves. And you can also use it to make more goal-directed behaviors. So there'll be another video next. So for example, forming a cantilever or forming chains. And so it may be that all of these different behaviors that army ants and weaver ants and fire ants do are actually variations of the same behavior, which is that I want to get somewhere. And if I can't get there and someone steps on me, I just hang out and let other individuals use me as part of the structure to get somewhere else. And so we're starting to understand how these different algorithms might actually all arise from a very simple behavior. And it's still really hard to do these kind of experiments with army ants and weaver ants, but we think that we are sort of beginning to understand what fundamentally might be going on behind the scenes. All right, let's see how much time I have. Okay, I'm just going to show one quick thing, and then I want to show you some fish robots before I run out of time. Okay, so of course, our ants, the robots that climb over each other is like kind of science fiction, but climbing robots have a lot of applications. And so with Dr. Errol Ekblad, we've been looking at systems thinking about robots that move over structures for inspection. So we're really inspired by creating swarms of climbing robots. And this is just an example of one of the robots that was developed in her lab called Robobles that we use. And we tested this on zero-G flights. But we've also been looking at how the same algorithm can be used in a more generalized way. So this is my PhD student, Sneha. And the idea is that if you think about army ants that are walking, those are the army ants that are doing a productive job. And if you think about the bridge, those are ants who are kind of sacrificing their productivity in order to help the group. And so you have these essentially two roles. One role is doing the task that the colony wants, and the other one is providing the infrastructure for the task. And so Sneha has generalized this idea to think of it as strategic sacrifice. So you have two states, the inspection state, for example, and the beacon state, or the productive and the infrastructure state. And then we are thinking about using that same kind of loop where as the environment changes, we can adjust the number of individuals who are part of the infrastructure versus who are part of the job. And Sneha has shown that at least in well-mixed cases, we can show that this can maximize productivity. So you can actually have the system proportion your swarm into the right proportions to maximize the productivity. Once it's in a more spatial setting, it gets a lot more complicated because now you're sort of interacting differently. But it's a sort of exciting area where we think the same algorithm might be used in very, very different settings. All right, I'm going to skip this for a second. All right, so the last system that I wanted to just quickly show you has to do with fish. So army ants, of course, are creating these structures like bridges, and termites are creating all of the structures I've said before. They're pretty much static. So the end goal is to make a structure, and then the structure maybe edits slightly. But fish are really different. They're creating structures in motion. So now you're coordinating both motion and being next to each other. And fish are really, really remarkable at this. So it's believed that they can, when they move together, not only are they moving together in these aligned forms, but they even take on relationships with each other to reduce the energy cost of moving together. So you can think that a group is actually just so much more efficient than individuals. So what if we could build robots that would leverage the same principles as fish do? And there's actually an immense amount of work in this field thinking about creating underwater robot swarms, or at least underwater robots, for lots of applications, like thinking about following algae blooms or understanding what's going on in coral reefs. And it still remains pretty hard. So one of the hard parts is that underwater, most of the techniques that we're very comfortable with, like GPS and wireless, don't actually work. So signals do not transmit underwater the same way as they do above. And we haven't quite destroyed the underwater world yet. So there's also some thought that we shouldn't try to create large acoustic beacons and create a mess underwater the way we have done in the past. So it's been more challenging. Fish, on the other hand, use a really different mechanism of coordination that's called implicit coordination. So rather than always sort of talking to your neighbors to do things, we're spending a lot of time observing neighbors and reacting. So fish use their vision as well as their lateral line, which senses pressure, to examine their neighbors and take action based on their neighbors. And then, of course, your action influences your neighbor's action, which then influences your action. So there's a complex feedback loop that's going on. So there's been a ton of work compared to army ants and other ones where we don't know the rules. Actually, in fish and bird flocks, there's been a ton of work, theoretical work on the rules. So we actually have an idea of how to do this. The problem is how to build it. And so a lot of the project that I'm going to show you just a few pieces of is really building robots underwater that can work together through implicit coordination. And hopefully we can program all of those amazing behaviors that we see fish do and utilize them for future applications. So this was the BlueSwarm project that was led by Florian Berlinger in my group and is now sort of expanded to create a lot more robots. And I'll just show you a video of the robots. So this is the robot, just so you can see the size. It's really quite small. We really want to create small robots that can be very agile. And the robot can move in all 3 dimensions. We sort of invented, special actuators for this. And the robots have cell phone camera eyes, which is, we're really trying to add now computer vision to this, but it's still really hard to process. So we were thinking about using very simple patterns on the robots, in this case, blue lights. So what the robot actually sees is something like this. So it sees a lot of dots moving around, which are its mates. And it has to use this sort of very simplified perception of the swarm in order to make decisions about what to do next. And I think that in a lot of theoretical systems, we assume we can see all of the neighbors, but in reality, we're all actually very good at running algorithms with other people without knowing a whole lot of detail. So we're using this system as a testbed to look at different kinds of behaviors. And so far, we've actually been able to program a lot of different behaviors. I would say for me, this was, of course, I said with all confidence to my graduate students, yes, we will build this and everything will work. But secretly, I was really worried that nothing would work. So I'm happy to report that I successfully fooled my grad students into making it work. And they were able to create really, really amazing kinds of motions. So here's an example where you have sort of like the bait ball. So it's a circular motion where the robots are trying to be in a circle, and you can actually add and remove robots from the circle. We could even program compositions. So I was describing this idea of a handbook of algorithms and then composing it to do something more complicated. So a little hard to see, but here the robots disperse, they look for something, one of them finds it, communicates to the others, and then they all gather. So we're actually able to stream together all of these different systems. And we're really starting to use this system to probe the difference between the theory and practice. So we have all these idealized algorithms, but understanding what in the idealized algorithms is idealized and what are the things that actually are perfectly fine to assume is difficult without a physical system to play around with. And that's one of the things that we've been doing. And more recently in my group, we're starting to make other versions of this robot, a larger robot that we think would be able to actually move in a coral reef, but also even smaller robots where we could potentially have hundreds of them and see how the fluid interactions are starting to work with each other. So this is my new team at Harvard, and we're calling it the Blueniverse, so that we have robots at all of these different scales. But we're still pretty far from getting in the wild. This was our first attempt. This is Florian at Walden Pond during the pandemic, actually. And they took all of the robots out for a swim. So we're now trying to sort of recreate this and see if we can build robots that we would actually trust and be able to take in coral reef environments that would be safe and be able to move around, but then maybe be able to coordinate and do things like monitor and produce maps and other things. And having small robots that maybe are less damaging to the environment, I think is sort of exciting to me, that maybe we would create something that is a little bit more compatible with the environment that we have. All right. So those are the ones that I wanted to show to you guys. Thank you. I know it was a lot of videos really fast. All right. So what can thousands of individuals do together as a collective? I always like to say that science is the thing that we really do well as a collective. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Professor Maya Matarik, who said that intelligence is a social phenomenon. So we are very social. So it's really, the work in my group has now become a lot of scientists, a lot of mathematicians, a lot of engineers, and more recently, we've been working with architecture and artists also to think about swarms in that space. And I think it's really this, we have all these discipline boundaries. I think for a reason, although I'm not sure what the reason was. But I think in dissolving those boundaries, there's really a lot of fun and discoveries to be made. So yeah, I think that's maybe the most prominent part of the collective intelligence that I've learned. All right, I think that's all I had to say. I know that was a lot of videos very fast. Awesome. Right. Yeah. So if I rephrase the question as sort of in these systems, I could compare what could have been achieved by a centralized system versus a decentralized system and sort of look at what was gained by doing it in a decentralized way. I think in the beginning, I used to spend a lot more time thinking about that question. I think a lot of my research, we aren't so good about answering that question. Mostly, the question we were asking were, what are the things that I can do in a decentralized way that you imagine could never be done except in a centralized way? So I'm trying to prove that decentralized systems can do things that will surprise you, which doesn't mean that they're doing better than the centralized system, but rather that centralized was not your only choice. I think when you compare the decentralized versus the centralized, there's some really interesting comparisons to be had. I think in many cases, the decentralized systems have a robustness that the centralized systems don't have. So in a centralized system, you might have that, your leader or your hierarchical tree that you created has a lot of ways that you have to worry about fixing it. Whereas in the decentralized system, you're usually working with self-stabilizing algorithms. And so perturbations are like different initial states. And so I think in some ways, if you have a very static environment, it would be very wasteful to have this self-stabilizing system. But if you had a system that is being subjected to many different situations, then your decentralized system is much better. So I think that's the algorithmic comparison. But as we started building hardware, the hardware comparison is much more stark. So I cannot build a global eye that will see everything. And that difficulty of building is so hard that basically the centralized system is not viable. So a lot of times on the hardware side, it's a little bit easier to reason. And it's like nobody wants to build a centralized system, and so it's not going to exist. So you're not competing with a centralized system, if that makes some sense. Like if you think about the underwater fish robots, without a really good wireless system underneath, having a central individual give everybody instructions is just not viable. And so right now, the way people do it is, so I showed a picture of Naomi Leonard, who's my colleague, and they use the Slocum gliders. So what the gliders do is underwater, they glide and they get information, and then they come up to the surface, they connect to GPS and wireless, and some coordination happens, and then you go underwater, and then you come back up. So the way you basically have to come back up to the surface on a regular basis in order to run. And then you can run a centralized algorithm if you want. But underwater, you're completely disconnected from each other. So that would be, it's so different because of the hardware concerns. So I think in the hardware system, there's really a much bigger difference between centralized and, but it's something I think about all the time. Thank you. Asai, I have to buy you some candy or some prize for like opening it up. All right. So I lost to, all right, you get to ask me. So is there a specific example? I mean, I think like machine learning, we're also all like, oh, sorry, yeah. So is the collective intelligence that we're learning, is it generalizable? Is that a good approximation? Yeah, I would say in some of the systems, I've tackled that problem more. So when we were thinking about self-assembly or the robots doing construction, we did want to generalize the biological algorithms to make structures other than what exist in biology. So termites just make towers. We wanted to say there's a compiler that you can draw the house you want and the robots build the house that you want. So that's a kind of generalization. But I would say in the other systems, it's not been as prominent. We've had a harder time having a clear path to generalizability. So I think in the case of the fish robots, we've really been just going for versatility. So can I repeat this handbook? Like you can do dispersion, you can do alignment, you can do, and then if I have these basis behaviors, I can combine it into like a navigation algorithm. And now you can decide as a user what you want the navigation algorithm to do, but I just built the pieces of navigation, if that makes sense. So it's not quite as nice of a generalizing principle, but then navigation is a general concept. So yeah, I'm still not sure how to think in this new world about the generalization question. All right. Who you want to ask me, since you're all the way in the back and I saw your hand?
So I love developmental biology. I think it's one of the coolest technologies I've ever unbelievably powerful, and I think we want to appreciate just how it's happening. And so I think it's really cool to exploit the power of developmental biology more here. It strikes me that cells are doing doing two things simultaneously, two hard jobs. One is that they're creating multiple overlapping different coordinate frames. They're quite complicated. And to spit that all up and capture chemical driving, create all the patterns that you're driving to see in developmental biology. And the second thing is that you know how to respond. Given all of these different coordinates that I frames that I made in my locations within each of these coordinate frames, what should I become, what should I do? And it seems like your work is tackling both of those things as well, passing the information around locally and responding to it to do something like combine. And I'm wondering if you thought at all about decoupling the two. Letting something, there's work by Ken Stanley called CPPNs, I'm not sure if you're aware of it. I think it's really cool. And it abstracts the process of laying down these different patterns and produces them in a really elegant way. It doesn't require local recipe patterns. But you can still have a distributed sort of robots responding to those things, just like the cells in the body respond in differentiate based on. And I'm wondering if you think that that might be interesting or worthwhile and you get a lot more expressive power, or in contrast, if that's not what you want, because in water, for example, we can't have a global coordinate thing to communicate that. We really need to be able to pass information locally like so. So can you talk to me? You think all that?
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to try and repeat like a little bit of that question. But you and I are on the same page, so like I know what you're talking about. So developmental biology, cells are both making patterns, but then self-assembling based on those patterns, and then making more patterns, and then self-assembling, and it's a very complicated process versus just having a process that made patterns that was different and a process that responded and self-assembled. So I would say like all of us have tried different things. We're willing to do anything that works. So if you look at Daniela Rus's group that did the Pebbles project, they were really trying to shrink these elements down and to make them attach. So they're little sort of square modules. You actually just like push them together. They all lock together. And then they basically sort of project or create a pattern, and then everything that's not part of the pattern just falls off. And so we were kind of doing that with the disassembly one. And I think that method is most like what you're suggesting, where the pattern formation is separate from the response piece. I think as long as we're talking about simple self-assembly, we can do these sort of one-shot solutions. But if you think of like the fruit fly, it's making this pattern, then it's forming the segments, but then the neural tube is like deforming a hole through the center. Now it's all deformation. So most organisms are using like 15 different ways of self-assembly. And I think because we're not able to do that, we're not able to make complex things. So we're still limiting ourselves to like only additive manufacturing or only X or only Y. And as long as we're stuck with one method, we can't actually achieve what developmental biology does, which is exploit all of these different ways to create everything in the easiest way possible. So I think we're still really far from thinking, and I think if you wanted to get closer to that, then synthetic biology is maybe like the best case, right? Where you're really programming cells, and then cells already have all the mechanisms to do these things. We just have to figure out how to mess with the instruction set. And so I think that that's a much nicer path, you know, to get to that. But yeah, I'm also a big fan of developmental biology. So yeah, all right.
I'm ready for all this. But my question was, is there anything that you found interesting in this piece where you develop emergent? Was there anything, any observation and they were interested in very different goals?
Yeah, I mean, I think, okay, so just repeating the question, thank you. So were there emergent behaviors that we saw that we didn't expect beyond just producing the behaviors that we were trying to produce? And I would say that maybe less than I thought. I think maybe because the systems that I was thinking about, I was always very focused on producing predictable structure. I think the Army Ants project was the first time we were really looking at an emergent behavior that we had no idea whether it made sense and what it was capable of. For me, I think that was maybe the closest to thinking about emergent behavior. But I do have a lot of colleagues who approach this from a really different point of view and use some of their algorithms too. So they take these systems and they use evolutionary algorithms or machine learning to actually explore the space of behaviors that could happen. And so one of the examples that I showed where the robots actually go in a circle, there are complicated algorithms to make like that, but this group actually discovered that there was a very simple emergent algorithm that could do this. And it looks like the individual is following the person in front of them, but then the loop gets closed. And so it's like the animal is following its own tail. And it's so robust that once that loop closes, it's actually, you can prove that the system is stable. But that algorithm was discovered by an evolutionary algorithm. And so if I were better at machine learning, I would explore more of that. I think a lot of times I'm looking at systems in biology and waiting for the biologist to say, oh, this is an interesting behavior. This is what we think is going on. And then we're emulating it. So we're missing a little bit of this emergence phenomenon. Whereas the groups that are really doing this exploration to start with are actually discovering emergent phenomenon. But yeah, there's groups that really specialize in that, and we just their work. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Yeah, so the various species which you model these swarming species tend to be these very high R species, so a lot of them die in the process, but your robots don't seem to do that. Is that because of a lack of scientific interest, or is it that you can't?
Who told you that a lot of my robots don't die in the process? Yeah, I think it's actually interesting. I think that we actually think that things die more than they actually do. So like if you look at the army ants in the bridge are not dying. They're actually just getting up and like going back to the swarm. And so they're really much better at assuming these different roles and then somehow not getting damaged. So I would say our robots get damaged a lot, whereas biology actually repairs itself so much better. So our death is permanent and that their death is not, and then they also reproduce. So it's like a much better system than what we have. But yeah, I think that the closest we've come, so to repeat the question, it's in biology, death is an important factor also in these algorithms, and we're not exploiting that quite as much. I think the closest we've come to is both the example of the disassembly, where you're saying that everything that moved off is not helpful, but you can gather it up and use it again. But the structure is just whatever was left. So that's one example where we were really explicitly trying to model cell death as a way of making structures. And then I think the other one, the army ant bridges are an example. You are taking part of your swarm out of the production process. So they're not inspecting, they're just standing there as beacons, or they're just infrastructure. And so they're not contributing to the thing you wanted them to contribute to, but they are helping the swarm achieve something better. So that's maybe a little bit more like a temporary sacrifice. So I think a lot of the systems I looked at earlier, we had not considered that at all, but we're starting to like think about this, this idea that, the removal of agents, or if you have enough agents, then discarding them is a perfectly good algorithmic choice. Or basically, temporarily taking them out of the picture is a perfectly good algorithmic choice. But I think those are the only two examples that we have right now where we've done that, or even imagined that we have enough robots to do that. Yeah.
It seems like collective intelligence has a lot of strengths, and also one central system has a lot of strengths. And I think, to me, it seems like nature sometimes mixes them. Like the hand probably, that's pretty well illustrated with creation, this kind of black out of the monitor. We able to simulate also now centralization. So I was wondering if you could comment on whether you think it's an interesting question to blend those two approaches. If people are studying what the strengths of that.
Yeah, so I think, okay, so to repeat the question is, collective intelligence has a lot of strengths, but centralized systems could also have strengths. Would it make sense to blend the two in order to solve a problem? And I would say like I would think that any real system we would build, that's what we would do. We would definitely blend the two. So even though my group, we focus on kind of pushing the boundaries of what you can do with decentralized systems, I always think of it as like, if you don't know what you can do with decentralized systems, then you're always going to build a centralized system. If you know what you can do with decentralized systems, then you're going to have a better chance to blend, right? Because you can pick the centralized and pick the decentralized. So I think some examples, like there are a lot of examples in biology of that. So if you look at smaller groups like wolves, or if you look at, if you look at teams, or like you're not looking at bison, but you're looking at smaller groups, there often is a much higher degree of like specific roles in the structure. So they might be a matriarch, or there might be, the main leader of the pack. So in those systems, it does appear like there is much more of a centralized system. So one question is centralized better in smaller groups? Like, is it inefficient to be decentralized when you're a small group? But then when you're a large group, it's just too hard to make a leader who can like yell and like wave at everybody. And so you're forced to rely on decentralized methods. But it's not totally clear. Like, I think that's my very naive view of biology, which is that, wolf packs and herds of elephants behave one way where there's a clear hierarchy, and then there are other ones where there's not. There are examples like meerkats where there is a hierarchy, and so externally it looks like everybody is the same, but internally there actually is a meerkat mother who is in charge. And people have used that one as an example to test whether we understand, I guess it's a test of biologists. So I give you this behavior and you're like, oh, it's decentralized. And they're like, oh, it's meerkats. We actually know who's in charge. And so sometimes we think things are decentralized when they're not, or we think they're centralized when they're not. So even for the biological systems, it's not clear from observation if we're inferring the correct algorithm. So again, like there might just be a lot more blending going on, and we just don't understand it yet. I think in a system like, I mean, you could think of cloud computing. I worked at Amazon Robotics, where there are the warehouses. Those are all blended. There's some amount that's centralized, and there's some amount that's decentralized. So there might be a centralized system that's deciding which packages need to be picked up and which one needs to be dropped. but then the robots are like individual drivers that plot their own paths and decide what to do and deal with traffic and congestion. And so you might choose to have this blended system because that makes sense from an applications point of view. So I would definitely say like any real world system you would blend. And I don't actually know what the rules are for blending. I think we're all just winging it in a pretty ad hoc way. Yeah.
Mark, you can ask about robots dying or agents dying later, right? In software and hardware, there can be a problem. But agents can behave maliciously. There might be a bug, they might have a something, some nodes may go back. So do you tackle these kinds of problems, or do these collective intelligence algorithms would be able to tackle these problems which differ from the interaction?
Right. In nature, it also does happen. I would say that some of the reason we can get away with doing simple things is that we're just running little demonstrations. We're not deploying anything, and we don't have to live in the real world. But for example, if you think of a fish pool, there's a lot of work on detecting predators. So a predator comes and the individuals see the predator, and then the whole swarm reacts really fast. But you don't want that, like this one fish was like just bored and went to the side, or like itched itself, or just got startled, and you don't want the whole swarm to take off. So somehow the swarm has to be really responsive to a real threat, but then also be able to filter out outlier behaviors or just, incorrect behaviors. And we don't really understand well how that. But there are a lot of groups that actually make fake predators and like actually do probe this behavior to see like how do you both have insensitivity and responsiveness in a system. And I think that's very similar to a lot of they don't realize this, but a lot of systems problems about like false positives and false negatives, and sort of thinking about that space. So real fish and real organisms have a lot of these issues. The only system that we built where we really dealt with malicious actors or adversarial, I forgot to repeat the question, but the question was about malicious individuals. The only case where we really dealt with that was when we were doing experiments with 1,000 robots. So in 1,000 robots, there are robots that did the wrong thing. Like, you're supposed to go this way, and they're like, no, we're going this way, right? And you don't want the whole system. So one example was you would have a robot stop, and then there would be just this traffic jam of like the whole thing stopped. So we actually started thinking about immune systems and thinking about how we could program behaviors where other robots could recognize ill behavior in other robots. And so we had sort of this extra behavior where the individual robots would detect if moving robots were getting stuck. And then they would basically tell the stuck robot, it's like, you're stuck, you're really not going anywhere, we've measured for a while. And then that robot would reboot itself. So you have this little Kilobot essentially reboot its motors and start all over again, because in the beginning, like we couldn't even get 100 robots to finish the algorithm without an error that brought the thing to a halting stop. So in 1,000, we definitely had to start thinking about what are the kinds of algorithms that are separate from this, but are just about detecting faults and fixing faults, and what are the common faults that are going to occur. But we really only experienced that when we had 1,000 robots. And again, that's still so hard for us to build. So there are similar examples in Amazon robotics and stuff, of course, hidden behind the proprietary walls. But in those cases, the robots do malfunction, and they can't send a human out every time something happens. So they do also have algorithms that are constantly trying to look for faults and fix faults within the system. Yeah, we definitely have to, even though it's not like quite malicious, but it can be fatal still, right? I can do an action that very easily makes the algorithm not be able to, or just deadlock the entire system. So, yeah.
Adversarial attacks for millennia, so it makes sense to be robust. But I wanted to ask you more in depth on your work. Have there been any specific delightful cases of conflict? I was wondering if there's any other cases that your lab is currently researching on.
sorry, you might have to repeat the question part of it. So like beyond these examples. Okay, so beyond these examples, looking at biomimicry, right now a lot of my lab is actually looking at underwater robots. So that's one big area where we've been focusing a lot of attention. And mainly because the robot that we built is actually quite slow and also a little weak. So we can't be in currents and we can't actually take advantage of currents to do energy harvesting. And so we're starting to like look at more forms of what happens underwater. And of course, underwater creatures use so many different things. So it's like quite a delightful biomimicry space. But another area that we've become more excited about is thinking about swarms in architecture, which isn't exactly biomimicry. So we have this project called the Swarm Garden, where we're building, they look like flowers, but basically if you thought of a building that's its facade was itself a swarm. So as the lighting changed, or as the environment needs change, or as there are more or less people, you imagine that this facade could change its structure, letting in more or less light and adapting to user behavior. So the person who I'm working with, she's really interested in human swarm interaction. And so we were thinking about plants and the way plants interact both as individuals and as groups to lighting, and also how we feel when we're around plants in this environment. So we have this, the reason it's called the Swarm Garden is that the individual facade elements look like flowers. And so we decided to hold an exhibit where we had this space, and then you could interact with it with a wearable, but then it could also interact with environment stuff. So it's not quite biomimicry, but I do feel like we're really inspired by how nature can make you feel. So if you think about being outside, the lighting is always changing and like leaves are moving. But when we're inside, the environment becomes really static and it sort of stops. And like, what would happen if like, even when you were inside, you felt like there were leaves moving around? Like, would you feel really differently about your indoor environments if they were more responsive and adaptive the way your outdoor environments are? So it's a completely different area. And it's not in my talk because I don't know how to stitch it into the story yet. But that's an area that we're starting to move into, is just working with people in architecture and thinking about stuff in that space. Wait, one more? Okay, you pick. Okay.
I have questions about, basically, when I'm looking at work, it looks as though like a lot of it approaches sort of modeling these complex behaviors from a top-down perspective, and looking at biology and getting inspiration from that. Is there sort of any similar work? Is there any work in this field where you're doing it bottom up, basically, where you're able to like you wanted before the circle example, you're able to sort of prove that there exists solutions for state achieving.
Yeah, so so that question is, a lot of the work in my group is top down, which is a very good assessment of what I do. And then what's the kind of work that's happening bottom up? And I would say that even some of my colleagues that I mentioned, like Sabine Hort and her former advisor, Dario Floriano, their groups really do come from much more of a bottom-up approach, which is why when she took Kilobots, she did Turing patterns. And they're much more interested in this bottom-up approach, where there's much more flexibility in the structures that are created. Things are more adaptive in nature. And I would say like a lot of the people in that area do think of the systems as not just looking at the end product of biology, but looking at the process. So what is the evolutionary process that produced this answer? And if we indeed also model that evolutionary process, then I can actually create all kinds of behaviors that a system could have. I can explore the space of possible behaviors. And I think that does become necessary, because as long as we're in biomimicry, we're sort of starting from the end state. And so we have gotten rid of, we're starting from the thing we understand and the thing that survived lots and lots of natural selection. So it might have been like narrowed down into something very predictable. And I think if you wanted to do that bottom up, it does make sense to like also include the evolutionary process or the learning process into it. So I would say like there's actually a pretty big community within the swarm community that has always looked at it that way. I'm scared, I'm really bad at it. So every time I try to do that kind of work, my machine learning algorithms learn nothing and my evolutionary algorithms produce nothing. And so I feel like I still haven't learned how to ask that question in a productive way. And so I'm glad that I have colleagues who are really good at doing this. But I would say like there's some really amazing examples where one of the groups looked at division of labor. So like if we said, let's take all the chairs out of this room, we could all pick up a chair and take it out of the room. But it could also be that people on this side just move all the chairs to the middle, and then some people move chairs from the middle. So now you're creating an assembly line. And so there's examples in ants where there actually is an assembly line, and nobody understands like how this emerges. So they were actually looking at the evolutionary conditions under which one kind of task allocation would emerge versus another, and showing that it could emerge spontaneously, that you would spontaneously decide that an assembly line was better than the other one. And that was a really amazing piece of work that also influenced how people were thinking about ants. So not just we would make robots do this, but also like how is this evolving within ants? And I think that kind of bottom-up work is really exciting. It's not what my group works on, but it is a really exciting area, and there's a lot of discoveries happening there. All right, I think, all right, thank you guys.